What's gaming, gamers? Today, I've got a Warlock build for you centered around the exotic helmet Dawn Chorus, the solar aspect Heat Rises, and the exotic solar auto rifle Tommy's Matchbook. Now, before I get into any detail about the build, I want to make it very clear that this build isn't really a good build. I wouldn't bring this along for anything Master difficulty or above, and you do have to play well to have it work even in Legend difficulty stuff. But what it lacks in prowess, it makes up for tenfold with how fun it is to run. Genuinely, I can't overstate how much fun this build is in my opinion, so if you have the means to, please give this build a try when you're grinding Terminal Overload, Vanguard Strikes, or anything of that nature. But before I get into the video proper, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster Strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us, the link is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me play games more often, come hang out with me over on Twitch. With Guardian games now in full swing, I've been streaming some of my grinding, so if that interests you, the link to my Twitch is in the description. With all of that out of the way, I can get into the build itself, starting with describing the Dawn Chorus exotic helmet. Dawn Chorus has the exotic perk Rites of Ember, which causes your Daybreak projectiles to deal 90% more damage and apply 30 Scorch stacks upon contact with an enemy. When running Ember of Ashes, Daybreak projectiles will apply 40 Scorch stacks to enemies instead of its base 30. Furthermore, the Scorch effect itself deals 200% increased damage from all sources, not just your Daybreak projectiles, and every time your Scorch effects tick damage onto an enemy, you're granted 5% melee energy. This amount of melee energy is affected by the recent changes to ability tiers and scaling ability gains, but I'll talk more about that specifically later in the video. Now, to get into the subclasses setup, I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll detail what each subclass element does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For your super, run the Daybreak super. Run the Phoenix Dive, whichever jump you prefer, the Celestial Fire melee, the Healing Grenade, the Heat Rises aspect, the Touch of Flame aspect, Ember of Ashes, Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Singeing, and Ember of Torches. To describe the subclass in more detail, firstly, the super. Daybreak is chosen as it is heavily enhanced by the Dawn Chorus exotic helmet as I've explained. Plus, this build has plenty of healing potential and doesn't really require the Well of Radiance for that specifically. Next, the Phoenix Dive is chosen as it's a fantastic source of burst healing, as well as an extra source of both applying Scorch stacks to enemies and the restoration buff so long as Heat Rises is active. Onto the melee ability, Celestial Fire is brought as it deals a decent amount of Scorch stacks from range. I prefer Celestial Fire for this build, especially this season, as paired with the seasonal artifact, it allows solar ability damage to be dealt from a distance. If you want to, you can run Incinerator Snap and not lose out on anything except the range. In fact, Incinerator Snap applies more Scorch stacks to enemies, suggesting all of the projectiles hit, so if it's just pure Scorch application you're after, Incinerator Snap is probably the better option. For the grenade, I choose to run the Healing Grenade as it will proc the Restoration ×1 buff upon its consumption when activating Heat Rises. The Healing Grenade is also a fantastic source of burst healing when you find yourself at low health without any other healing options available to you, making it a great panic button in certain scenarios. Running any of the damaging grenades is also viable, with the only trade-off being the fact that you won't be granted restoration instantly upon activating Heat Rises and will instead have to use your Phoenix Dive to be granted restoration ×2. Onto the aspects, firstly, Heat Rises. Heat Rises is the main aspect for use with this build and is what synergizes heavily with both Tommy's Matchbook and Dawn Chorus. Heat Rises allows you to shoot your weapons, use your melee ability, and your grenade ability while gliding. Just having the Heat Rises aspect equipped grants your weapons 20 points to their airborne effectiveness stats, and also grants you the ability to generate a differing amount of melee energy upon getting kills while airborne, depending on the tier of enemy killed. Furthermore, Heat Rises grants you the ability to consume your grenade, which grants you the Heat Rises buff for 30 seconds. While Heat Rises is active, you're granted an additional 50 points to your airborne effectiveness, modifications to your jump that allow you to stay airborne for longer, and any kills obtained while airborne increases the Heat Rises timer. Heat Rises' timer can't exceed 30 seconds, but it can be extended to this 30-second maximum effectively indefinitely so long as you continue to get kills while airborne. The second aspect to run is Touch of Flame. Touch of Flame will enhance certain grenades. For this build, the enhancement to the healing grenade is the most impactful one. With Touch of Flame equipped, your healing grenade will grant you Cure ×2 and Restoration ×2 upon its use, which simply increases its healing output and acts as a second source of the Restoration ×2 buff instead of requiring the use of your Phoenix Dive. As for the fragments, firstly, Ember of Ashes is important for this build as it ensures you apply more Scorch stacks to enemies. Having more Scorch stacks applied to enemies ensures they're scorched for longer, which increases the total amount of damage your Scorch does, as well as granting you more overall melee ability energy with the Scorch ticks. Furthermore, Ember of Ashes allows you to cause more ignitions, which are a big part of this build's combat effectiveness. Next, Ember of Empyrean allows you to extend the duration of all Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you by getting kills with your solar weapons or abilities. This is important, especially for the Restoration buff, as the Tommy's Matchbook exotic auto rifle damages you while using it, making Restoration a necessary buff to have procced consistently as possible. Ember of Empyrean does come with a 10-point stat deficit to your Resilience stat, but that's offset by the Restoration uptime granted by this fragment. The third fragment, Ember of Singeing, grants you a 300% increase to your class ability's recharge rate for 3 seconds upon applying Scorch stacks to an enemy. This buff can only be granted once every 3 seconds and can't be doubled up on by applying additional Scorch stacks to the same or different enemies. However, with how much Scorch this build applies overall, you'll almost always have Ember of Singeing procced, which significantly increases your Phoenix Dive's uptime, and in turn, your Restoration and Cure potential. Lastly, for fragments, Ember of Torches will grant you the Radiant buff for 8 seconds upon dealing any powered melee damage. This is one reason why Celestial Fire is used instead of Incinerator Snap, as it allows you to proc the Radiant buff from a safe distance. Radiant is a very powerful buff to take advantage of with this build, and its uptime is imperative to this build's effectiveness if you decide to push higher difficulty content. In combination with the melee ability generation of both Dawn Chorus and Heat Rises, you'll be able to proc Ember of Torches whenever you need to proc the Radiant buff for yourself. Ember of Torches does come with a 10-point stat deficit to your Discipline stat, but this doesn't matter at all as the healing grenade is mostly used as a panic button outside of the initial proc of Heat Rises. For alternative fragments, there are a few you can choose. Firstly, Ember of Searing causes the defeat of any scorched target to grant you a differing amount of melee energy depending on the tier of enemy killed, as well as summoning a fire sprite. Admittedly, the melee energy granted by Searing isn't too necessary, but the creation of fire sprites can be incredibly helpful for your healing grenade's uptime. So if you find you need your healing grenade off cooldown more often, Ember of Searing is a good option to increase its uptime. Ember of Searing also increases your recovery stat by 10 points, which is a nice boost to your class ability's base recharge rate, but with this build taking advantage of Ember of Singeing, this doesn't matter too much. Next, Ember of Solace simply increases the duration of most solar buffs applied to you by 50%. This is a helpful fragment if you find you have difficulties with keeping your Restoration buff active specifically, as both the Healing Grenade and Phoenix Dive don't grant Restoration for that long by default. Ember of Solace is most helpful in higher difficulties, wherein enemies have more health and are simply harder to kill in general. If you are to slot either of those alternative fragments, I recommend swapping them out for either Ember of Ashes or Ember of Singeing, whichever you find to be the least impactful for you specifically. With the subclasses setup now detailed, I can get into the seasonal artifact setup for use with this build if you're playing during Season 23, the Season of the Wish. This season's artifact synergizes fantastically with the solar subclass, and as such has plenty of mods that this build will benefit heavily from having equipped. Firstly, for artifact mods, in the second column run the Kindling Trigger mod. Kindling Trigger will cause your solar weapons to apply Scorch stacks to any enemy damaged by them while Radiant who isn't already afflicted with Scorch. This simply further increases your Scorch output and ignition uptime, which are both necessary for this build. Next, in the third column, run the Flint Striker mod. Flint Striker will cause rapid solar weapon precision hits and solar weapon final blows to grant you the Radiant buff. With this build, this mod is mostly helpful for keeping Radiant active when shooting at bosses, but is also a secondary way of keeping Radiant active when clearing out adds. The third mod to run, also in the third column, is Heart of the Flame. Heart of the Flame will cause the casting of your solar super to grant you the radiant buff, as well as a damage boost depending on the amount of allies nearby when you cast your super. This damage boost does work while solo, and grants your solar super a 6% damage boost when cast with no allies nearby. This is simply a free 6% damage boost, so this mod is worth bringing just for that. Next, in the fourth column, the Revitalizing Blast mod will cause your solar abilities to apply the Void Weaken effect to bosses and champions for 6 seconds. This is a 15% debuff to bosses and champions, meaning all damage dealt to that enemy is increased by 15% while they're afflicted with this Void Weaken effect. This mod is another reason why the Celestial Fire melee is chosen, as Celestial Fire allows you to proc Revitalizing Blast from a distance. Lastly, for artifact mods, in the fifth column, the Rays of Precision mod will cause any solar precision final blow while radiant to ignite the target killed. This is a fantastic source of ignitions, which is very helpful for this build's ad clearing potential. Now that the artifact is detailed, I'll get into the armor setup, starting with my recommendations for stat distribution. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience first, with Recovery second, and ignore Mobility altogether. Resilience is very important to spec into. Each tier of Resilience grants an additive 3% damage resistance, as well as increasing your total amount of health and shields, making Resilience especially important to have for harder difficulty content. Recovery is a close second to Resilience as far as importance goes. Recovery dictates the delay between having taken damage and the start of your health regenerating, as well as the rate at which you regenerate your health. Recovery is also the Warlock's class stat, meaning it directly affects the base cooldown of your class ability. Ember of Singeing does help your class ability's regeneration remarkably, and the Restoration buff will be your main source of health regeneration, which isn't affected by your recovery stat, so you don't need to spec too heavily into recovery. Mobility is the least important stat for this build in the top 3 stat grouping. Mobility increases your jump height and walking movement speed, but as this build isn't designed to jump high or walk fast, mobility isn't important. So, put stat points into other, more important stats and ignore mobility altogether. For the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Discipline first, with Strength second, and ignore Intellect altogether. Discipline governs the base recharge rate of your grenade ability, which is very helpful for your healing grenade's uptime. Having your healing grenade off cooldown more often allows you to use it to proc Restoration ×2 more often, as well as the Heat Rises buff if you lose it. As this build doesn't have any way of actively regenerating the grenade ability, unless you decide to run the Ember of Searing fragment to create fire sprites, having a high discipline stat is important. Next, Intellect is effectively a useless stat, as all it does is decrease the base cooldown of your super. It doesn't affect active super generation at all, and only affects the passive cooldown of the super, so speccing Intellect is pretty useless. Lastly, Strength is less important than Discipline, as this build will be generating a significant amount of melee energy from many sources. Strength is still a decent stat to spec into though, and I wouldn't ignore it altogether, but focus your Discipline stat more so than Strength with this build. With stat distribution now detailed, I can get into the Armor's mod setup for this build. I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll get into detail about what each mod does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For the prescriptive armor mod setup, on your helmet run 2 harmonic siphon mods and 1 heavy ammo finder mod. On your arms run 1 harmonic loader mod and 2 impact induction mods. On your chest piece, simply run whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. On your legs, run 1 recuperation mod and 2 solar surge mods. Lastly, on your bond, run 1 bomber mod, 1 powerful attraction mod, and 1 time dilation mod. To detail the armor's mod setup, firstly, the helmet's mods. The 2 harmonic siphon mods will cause solar weapon multi-kills to create orbs of power, which will be helpful for this build for generating your super, healing yourself, and granting armor charge. All of those things make orb of power generation useful, but they aren't as necessary for this build's functionality as some other builds, so don't stress too much if you aren't collecting orbs of power all too frequently. Next, the heavy ammo finder mod simply increases the amount of heavy ammo that will drop for you. With this build taking advantage of the Tommy's Matchbook exotic auto rifle, you'll get significantly more heavy ammo drops than normal, as exotic primary ammo weapons further increase the ammo drop rate from finder mods. Onto the arms mods. Firstly, the harmonic loader mod will simply increase the reload speed of all your solar weapons. Tommy's Matchbook has a very slow base reload speed, so even equipping this one harmonic loader mod will very noticeably increase its reload speed. Next, the two impact induction mods together will instantly grant you 14.875% energy for your healing grenade upon dealing powered melee damage. Impact induction does have an intrinsic 7-second cooldown between activations, meaning you can only be granted this grenade energy once every 7 seconds. However, these two mods will be very helpful overall for regenerating your healing grenade, and with how quickly this build can regenerate its melee ability, you'll be able to use the impact induction mods pretty much instantly off cooldown. For the chest pieces mods, simply running whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. This build doesn't require anything else, so think about what content you'll be running and equip resistance mods that correspond with the specific types of damage you'll be taking the most. Next, for the legs mods, the recuperation mod will simply grant you 67 health upon the collection of any orb of power. Admittedly, recuperation is slightly less necessary with this build as it's designed to have significant restoration uptime, but in the case you don't have restoration active or you simply need a quick boost of health, recuperation is an incredibly helpful mod in case you need it. Next, the two solar weapon surges together will grant your solar weapons a 17% boost to their outgoing damage while you have any stacks of armor charge. This is a significant increase to your Tommy's Matchbook's effectiveness, and it will help it to deal with enemies much more efficiently, especially when pushing harder difficulty content. Lastly, on your bond, the Bomber mod will grant your healing grenade 7.2% of its energy instantly upon the use of your Phoenix Dive. Bomber is brought mostly as a passive buff to your healing grenade's uptime, and isn't necessarily a mod I recommend using to actively replenish grenade energy. Rather, Bomber is brought to grant a small amount of grenade energy anytime your grenade happens to be on cooldown at the time you need to use your Phoenix Dive ability. This happens most often when proccing Restoration ×2 immediately after having consumed your grenade to proc Heat Rises, and as such, in that case, Bomber will see use quite often. Next, the Powerful Attraction mod will instantly collect any orb of power nearby to you upon the use of your class ability. As I mentioned, collecting orbs of power is incredibly beneficial to this build's effectiveness, and as you'll be in the air most of the time thanks to Heat Rises, automatically collecting orbs of power upon using your Phoenix Dive will make up for the lower rate at which you'll be manually collecting orbs. Lastly, for mods, the Time Dilation mod will cause your decaying stacks of armor charge to last for 15 seconds each instead of 10 seconds, increasing their uptime by at least 50%. Time Dilation is a fantastic mod with this build, as you'll have a maximum surge timer of 45 seconds instead of just 30 seconds with this one mod equipped. This makes your surges more effective over longer periods of time, which helps make up for this build's less than stellar orb collecting prowess. With the Armor's mod setup now entirely detailed, I can get into some weapon and weapon perk recommendations for use with this build. I'll start with the kinetic slot, then move on to the heavy slot, and finally I'll describe the Tommy's Matchbook exotic auto rifle in case you aren't aware about what it does. In the kinetic slot, I prefer to run a special ammo weapon as it'll make up for the lack of burst damage from most of the rest of this build. As for what type of special ammo weapon is best, that's almost entirely up to you. However, I recommend a weapon that can apply a stasis or strand debuff, as that'll help you proc the Torch artifact mod and will allow you to deal more damage to those targets. Specific weapons I enjoy using with this build are the Riptide Stasis Fusion Rifle from the Crucible weapon pool with the perk combination of Choke Clip and Autoloading Holster, the Scatter Signal Strand Fusion Rifle from the Season of the Wish with the perk combination of Slice and Controlled Burst, and the Lingering Dread Stasis Grenade Launcher from the Duality Dungeon with the perk combination of Choke Clip and Autoloading Holster. As for the heavy slot, I prefer to run a rocket launcher in this slot, as the rest of the build deals very well with groups of adds, leaving machine guns as less optimal options. Running a solar rocket launcher is best, as that will also benefit from the solar weapon surge mods in your legs to be granted a 17% boost to its damage. As for specific solar rocket launchers I recommend using, the Apex Predator solar rocket launcher from the Last Wish raid with the perk combination of Reconstruction and Bait and Switch, the Hez and Vengeance solar rocket launcher from the Vault of Glass raid with the perk combination of Autoloading Holster and Vorpal Weapon, and the Ascendancy solar rocket launcher, which is now purchasable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the Tower with the perk combination of Impulse Amplifier and Explosive Light. Now I'll get into the Tommy's Matchbook exotic auto rifle. Tommy's Matchbook has the exotic perk Ignition Trigger, which causes sustained fire to overheat the weapon. While overheated, Tommy's Matchbook deals more damage per bullet, but also deals damage to the wielder. The amount of damage dealt to the wielder is cut by 25% when hip firing. Furthermore, hip firing grants Tommy's Matchbook increases to its stability stat as well as its aim assist cone, which is helpful for firing accurately from the hip. Tommy's Matchbook's catalyst, Heat of the Moment, decreases the delay before your health starts to regenerate by 1 second while overheated, as well as causing every 5th bullet fired by the weapon to apply Scorch to any enemy while it's overheated. It is this interaction specifically that gave me the idea for this build in particular, so having the catalyst is required for this build to function how I've designed it to. With the entirety of the build now detailed, I'll get into a few playstyle tips and tricks when using this build to ensure you get the most out of it. Firstly, proc Heat Rises as early as possible into an engagement and do the same with Restoration. You want to have Restoration specifically when using Tommy's Matchbook, as Restoration will effectively nullify the self-damage inflicted by the weapon while it's overheated. Use your melee ability frequently to apply extra Scorch stacks to enemies and the Weaken debuff to bosses, as you'll be granted melee energy often when getting kills while airborne due to the Heat Rises aspect. Other than that though, just have fun. This build isn't meant to be a meta option or to carry you through Grandmasters, it's simply meant to be fun to use. And that's all for this video, thanks for watching. Again, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, the link to the Discord server is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me stream some games sometime, come hang out with me over on Twitch. The link for that is also in the description. If you have any questions or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day.